Welcome back to Insight. Now, a white Christian family in 1970s Oklahoma may seem an unlikely place to look for the origins of an influential American imam who reaches out to young Muslims on social media and annoys Daesh so much they've put him on a hit list. But that's the story of William Webb, now Imam Suhaib Webb, or the Snapchat Imam, as he's been called, and he joins me now in the studio. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
It's an interesting story. So tell me, how did a young white Christian born in 1970s Oklahoma end up as an imam?
In Oklahoma, indeed. Through a number of friends in high school in the music business, I was working with some local artists in Oklahoma who were involved in the hip hop community. And some of them, like my manager, his name was Hamza. He wasn't Muslim, but his name was Hamza, which is a Muslim name, and his brother's name was Latif. So they had tremendous access to like Islamic literature. So there were tremendous opportunities for really real robust conversations. So that started when I was around 16 or 17 years old. And I would ask them, like, why do you blow up buildings? You hate white people, you treat women inappropriately. And then they would say, no, you know, Muslims don't act this way.
But it went beyond just a simple interest, because becoming an imam is a position of authority. You are expected to interpret, to lead, to give messages.
So I studied with a Senegalese scholar for 10 years. So I memorized the Quran with him in Arabic and learned some of the basic texts. And when I finished, he told me, like, you know, you could be an imam now. And I had no idea. Like, that wasn't my trajectory. So even now, I don't really consider myself an imam. Like, that comes with a lot of loaded language and expectations.
And of course, you were an imam in Boston at the
Yes.
time of the bombings in 2013, and you came to prominence as the voice of the community. What do you remember about that day?
My phone just started lighting up, you know, prayers for Boston. Are you aware what's going on with Boston? So I just immediately booked a ticket. I didn't know what was going on. And then I found out, of course, that the Boston bombing, which is so iconic to our city. Ultimately, what was very powerful about Boston is the non-Muslim community was extremely supportive, because the Muslim community in Boston had really strived to create powerful relationships way before the Boston bombing happened. So people knew who the Muslim community was. I had a non-Muslim come to me and say, no one messes with my mosque, you know, and he's not Muslim. Muslims invested themselves in the Black Lives Matter, you know, gentrification, feeding the homeless.
But is that the experience of Muslims in the wider world? There seems to be a misconception. Many Muslims feel that they're being tarnished with the same brush when we talk about Daesh, when we talk about Islamist terrorism. A lot of Muslims feel under pressure and isolated in their own communities.
I agree, and I think that applies to us as well. Boston may be an anomaly, but what Boston did was, instead of allowing that community themselves to feel intimidated, they were able to recalibrate some of that negativity and use it to push them to invest themselves in communities.
But a lot of
change
communities are now, you know, you hear Donald Trump, a man who wants to be the next president of the US, talking about banning Muslims, about not allowing Muslims to live in the US. That has a very negative impact
Indeed.
on a lot of communities.
And that should only invigorate us more. You know, I told people, if Donald Trump wins, I have to turn it up, you know, five extra notches. You know, we're not going to sit by passively and let Donald Trump continue to, you know, use extremely hurtful language to women. Now he's calling Miss Piggy, Muslims, Black Americans,
What do you mean,
Latinos.
turn it up 500 notches?
I'm saying, you know, invest myself more in community, push back more on social justice issues.
But do you feel that you properly reflect the problems that a lot of Muslims feel, because you're white-skinned? A lot of Muslims find themselves being profiled, find themselves being banned on flights. You don't fit the stereotype, so can you properly feel what they feel?
I was detained here in England for 5 hours when I landed. But definitely white privilege is something that I have. White privilege will never leave me. White privilege allows me to move in ways that others can't move. But I see white privilege as Moses in the house of Pharaoh. And again, we have to denounce our privilege, but we should also utilize our privilege to fight that privilege. Donald Trump is the worst of white privilege, if you will, without the military piece. And then, of course, American foreign policy is rooted in white privilege as well as Islamophobia. So For Muslims in other parts of the world, I can't speak for them. Muslims in my community, I can speak on their behalf.
And you spend a lot of time reaching out to Muslims. You're known as the Snapchat Imam. Why is that the way that you want to communicate? I mean, I'll be honest, I do a lot on social media. Snapchat's beyond me. Why was that the way you chose to communicate?
Well, I despise, actually, and I'm averse to things like Snapchat, to be honest with you. I'm a Generation Xer, right? I'm not a millennial.
Despise Snapchat.
Yeah, so my students actually
reaction.
encouraged me to do it. Naeem and Ammar, who are two students of ours in DC. So initially I somewhat, kind of pushed back and said I have no interest in people being involved in my daily life. But they really encouraged me. And when I started, it just kind of metaphorically, we're talking about Muslims, exploded with around 200,000 people now following on Snapchat. And it's been a great experience. I've learned a lot from the people that, these different communities who have to struggle against Islamophobia very differently than, say, I as a white man in America.
There is a downside.
Yes.
Because you are on a Daesh hit list. Does that worry you?
I mean, of course, when someone puts you on a hit list, you feel very different than you did the morning before. I think in some ways it's an honor to be put on a hit list by people like that. It's like being insulted by Trump or being threatened. But my threats from the far right in America on my life have been far more than out from Daesh. But I think that theirs is a concern of messaging and struggle. I think the idea that we're at an apocalyptic time in the world, and you have other people saying, whether it's an apocalypse or not, we have to live a good life, goes against some of those teachings. Of course, killing people, terrorism, intimidation, reminding people that they've killed more Muslims than non-Muslims, issues like slavery,
and yet,
rights.
The problems, I mean, you're here in the UK, Europe, of course, is having a problem with integration, with a threat from extremists. We've seen attacks taking place in Germany, France. How do you see those challenges being resolved?
I would challenge Europe to rephrase this discussion. I think that Europe is having a problem with acceptance, not immigration. Canada, if you look at how Canada has welcomed the Syrians into their community, you see Syrian children producing now films talking about, what it means to be Canadian, and Canada seems to be doing very well. They've opened their doors to immigration. I think that instead of saying we have a problem, speaking on behalf of Europe or Western Asia, we have a problem with integration. No, I think you have a problem with acceptance. When I look at French Muslims, I see a community that has not been accepted. When I look at the ghettoization of Muslim communities within Europe, has the dominant white community accepted these people?
But isn't there an onus on Muslim communities as well to do more to be accepted?
No, it's reciprocal. I don't believe that we can blame either side, but if I bring you into my home, I'm responsible for cooking and serving you initially. And I think that countries have done that. I think many countries have afforded people great opportunity. I'm talking more about attitudes and perceptions, right? Not necessarily the politics. I think the attitudes of Europe have historically been very closed, right? Have been extremely restricted. Fascism is coming out of Europe, right, in the early part of the 20th century. So the acceptance of brown people into our culture and the acceptance of different cultural norms, I think are perhaps how we should be phrasing this discussion. When I say we have a problem with immigration, it's a one-sided discussion. No, we also have a problem with acceptance.
Yeah. It's been fascinating to speak with you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to have you with us. Imam Suhaib Webb there.
Appreciate it.
And that's all for now. I'm Shuli Ghosh. That was Insight.